The House of Representatives, February 28, 1906. Theodore Roosevelt's new pet legislation, the Hepburn Bill, has just passed the House. The act prevents the kind of behavior Standard Oil and the railroads engaged in to create monopolies and control prices. Justice Department lawyers are still fighting for Standard's breakups in the courts, but Roosevelt has realized that's not a productive avenue. They'll never catch everyone. To break the power of the trusts, Roosevelt can't rely on prosecuting illegal behavior after it's occurred. He has to prevent it with legislation. But the progressive-leaning House of Representatives isn't the real fight. That'll happen in the more conservative Senate, where Roosevelt will have to broker deals and make alliances to get the bill through, including with the congressman he hates most. Thanks so much to Audible for helping make our extra history research fun. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt gave a public speech discussing the role of journalism in the progressive movement. Illustrating the good and ill of crusading journalism, he compared them to a character from the philosophical novel Pilgrim's Progress, who used a rake to clear away muck.
The men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society,
Roosevelt said.
But only if they know when to stop raking the muck.
This speech showed Roosevelt's sometimes rocky relationship with the progressive press, who always pushed him to go further, but who he was also happy to cultivate and promote if it served his purposes. Indeed, political cartoons of the day cast Roosevelt as a crusading king, surrounded by knights representing prominent journalists and publications, with Ida Tarbell as Joan of Arc. The speech also gave Americans a new term for these investigative, story-breaking journalists: muckrakers, a label for what it's worth that Ida Tarbell hated. However, she was not the only investigative journalist taking on corruption and big business. In the same issue where she began her series on Standard Oil, her McClure's colleague Ray Baker took on the use of intimidation and violence by labor unions against their own members. But it was Baker's investigation into a miner workers' strike in Colorado that first brought him Theodore Roosevelt's attention. There, corporations, crooked politicians, and banks had ostensibly squeezed the miners' union on the issue of working hours until they'd ignited a full-on revolt, with miners bombing company mine shafts and beating or assassinating new workers brought in to replace the strikers. The governor, a banker himself, declared martial law and brought in the army. They arrested miners without warrants and threw them on deportation trains. One soldier threatened a judge with a bayonet outside of his own court. Baker, eminently fair, charted how foul play on all sides had escalated the conflict, and shared his article with Roosevelt before publication. Roosevelt liked the piece so much, he wrote a statement endorsing the article. And that collaboration would not be their last, as the young president and crusading investigator found their interests aligning again the next year on the issue of railroads. Baker's next article examined how the railroad trusts, many partially owned by titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, used lawyers and corporate structures to skirt the new laws against rebates and still offer discounted rates to favored big businesses. Baker pointed out that this was particularly unfair, considering that the government had literally given the land to railroads in order for them to lay track. If it was a public service, it should serve the public good. Once again, Roosevelt got early access to Baker's research, passing it on to the Interstate Commerce Commission and progressive lawmakers to begin crafting what would become the Hepburn Bill. Now, without getting too technical, the Hepburn Rate Act, named after the man who introduced it, would empower the ICC to regulate railroad shipping rates in the interest of leveling the playing field for businesses small and large. Going beyond rebates, the Hepburn Bill allowed the ICC to look at railroad companies' books and made it illegal to give out free passes to other companies' goods. And crucially for Rockefeller's business, it also covered pipelines. It passed the House of Representatives, where progressive Republicans were a major force, without amendment, and barreled onto the Senate, where it hit a brick wall, because there was one group that did not want this to pass: the conservative wing of Roosevelt's own Republican Party, many of whom had taken campaign contributions and personal free passes from the railroads. Chief among them was Republican leader Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was well known for killing progressive legislation that would impact big business. Having previously monkeyed with tariff rates to please the Sugar Trust, he also personally owned part of Rhode Island's trolley system until earlier that year he sold it to a railroad trust for an enormous profit. Aldrich and his conservatives attacked Roosevelt as a secret socialist, tying him to the furthest left elements of the party who wanted to nationalize the railroads. But in addition to refusing to pass the bill, Aldrich decided to hobble it further by delegating leadership on it to a prominent Democrat, and the senator Roosevelt hated most, Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Now, it's really hard to understate what an odious figure Benjamin Tillman was. Called Pitchfork Ben for his fiery speeches, Tillman rose to prominence during the fall of Reconstruction, when he led a paramilitary terrorist militia called the Red Shirts in a campaign of ballot box stuffing, voter intimidation, and murder against South Carolina's black community. A vocal proponent of the idea that African Americans must either be subservient or exterminated, he was for decades the most open white supremacist in Congress. And just for the record, in 1906, that's really saying something. He and Roosevelt loathed each other. In 1901, Roosevelt invited African-American educator Booker T. Washington to formally and publicly dine with the Roosevelt family at the White House, the first time a black man had done so. Tillman's response to this act was so racist that I'm not even going to repeat it here, but I'll put it up here on the screen so you get an idea what kind of man this guy was. Their relationship deteriorated further the next year, when Roosevelt withdrew Tillman's invitation to a White House dinner after he'd punched a fellow senator on the floor of Congress. And look, we could go on all day about how awful Tillman is, but ultimately this is an episode about railroad trusts, and I'm pretty sure by now you get how bad this guy sucked. But as much as Roosevelt hated Tillman, he was also a major opponent of the trusts. In fact, he was part of the Democratic bloc, attacking Roosevelt for not going after the trusts even harder. Despite their mutual distaste, Roosevelt reached out to Tillman, opening a channel of communication to negotiate on the finer points of the bill. Things didn't change between them. In fact, they never met in person, instead talking through a go-between. But they did work together as Tillman steered the bill through committee. Meanwhile, Roosevelt continued meeting with Ray Baker, getting his opinion on the legislation. Baker, to put it mildly, wasn't happy, because the Hepburn Bill was mostly concerned with regulating maximum shipping rates, ensuring railroads couldn't jack up prices on the smaller companies. But Baker argued the real problem was the minimum rates, because while raising rates got everyone's attention, it was the fact that the railroads played favorites by lowering rates for big companies that created unfair competition. He also showed Roosevelt how the railroads nickel and dimed smaller shippers by charging them more for elevator services, storage, refrigeration, and chronically underweighing shipments from favored companies. In fact, at this point, Baker pushed Roosevelt so hard to go even further than he was that the president became annoyed with him. Sure, he knew his ideas were good, but he also knew they wouldn't pass Congress, especially in his Tillman alliance. But Roosevelt's attempt to reach across the aisle failed. Tillman couldn't rally enough Democratic support to pass the bill, even combined with the Senate's progressive Republicans. Their partnership fractured, their relationship even worse, and Roosevelt back at square one. If he wanted to do anything, Roosevelt realized, he needed a middle way. Because on one hand, he had Democrats and progressive Republicans who wanted to nationalize railroads, a solution conservatives would not accept, and on the other, he had conservatives that wanted to do nothing. So he started fresh, reverting back to the original bill before it had been augmented with amendments suggested by Baker, Tillman, and pretty much everyone else. It was a simpler bill, one that did what Roosevelt wanted, but was much more moderate. It passed. Sure, it was full of loopholes and extraneous amendments, and would need to be strengthened in 1910, but Roosevelt had done what was previously thought impossible, to restrain a trust not just with the courts, but with preemptive legislation. Even Tillman set aside his qualms and voted for it. And that was good, because even as Roosevelt celebrated his latest victory against the trusts, a new book had come out detailing shocking abuse, danger, and monopoly in another American industry, the slaughterhouses of Chicago. Meaning Roosevelt's next task was to take a cleaver to the meat trust. And while we get into that very book, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, in our next episode, you could actually follow in Rob's footsteps and get a head start listening to it with Audible. Actually, we were quite psyched that they sponsored this episode because a ton of us at EC have been using and loving Audible for years now. And because they offer thousands of audiobooks, podcasts, and Audible originals that you can listen to while cooking, working out, or whatever else you need to get done in your busy schedule, there's something here for everyone. For instance, with the recent landing of NASA's Perseverance rover on Mars, I was inspired to re-listen to one of my favorites, The Martian, by Andy Weir, narrated by the one and only Will Wheaton. And I'm pretty sure that Jeff's been working his way through the entire Witcher series by Anders Sapkowski on Audible as well, and I'll give you 3 guesses on how I know that. Also, something else I really appreciate about Audible is their free and easy audiobook exchanges if I'm not feeling a title, and that my member credits can roll over for an entire year so I can engage with all their cool content at my own pace. And if you haven't yet started your audiobook adventures, you can visit audible.com/extra credits or text extra credits to 500 500 and you'll get your first 30 days of Audible free, plus a free audiobook of your choice, and you'll be helping to support our channel at the same time. Again, that's audible.com/extra credits. Help EC get free audiobook. A big extra credits thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 for their continued legendary patronage.